Okay, so welcome everyone. We're going to look at the second installment of Lewis's sci-fi trilogy, Perelandra, which I think is one of his best books as a work of literature, and which can be read on its own and understood on its own. I think that's one of the beauties of the three installments, but I think rightly needs to be seen in a sequence to get the full effect of the story. But it is a retelling of Paradise Lost. We were saying before the class that when you've read Paradise Lost and then you read Perelandra, you can see that Milton is in the forefront of Lewis's mind, and the encounter of an unfallen Eve with a figure of temptation is certainly part of this story. And but there's a lot of differences there, and I think the structuring of the novel will make that apparent, because Lewis starts off where he concluded, by putting himself in the narrative. You might have noticed. To reiterate what we said last time, in Out of the Silent Planet, in the last chapter, Lewis himself appears as a character, and Ransom meets and discusses with him what had happened to him. And one of the things I noted about the entirety of the trilogy is that we have something akin to a Bildungsroman, to use the technical term, literary term at any rate, Bildungsroman. But unlike a Bildungsroman, of which Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is one, we don't have the development of the character's mind by himself. He is not the architect of his own worldview. He does not take the position of the human sciences that we're autonomous selves that construct a world in accordance with our imaginations. Not even in Jordan Peterson's iteration on that, in terms of various archetypes, archetypal consciences, and we have to live with the consequences of that, because that again is a very self-centered anthropology and way of understanding reality. No, the Bildungsroman that Lewis depicts to us describes the development of the character's mind in conjunction with forces outside of himself that initiate the whole sequence of events, and in correspondence with, or in sometimes it's, as it proves to be the case here in this story, in communication with the mind of Ransom develops over the course of the trilogy. And that is consequential, because what Lewis is trying to do, and I said this last time, is he's trying to get us to undo the flattening effect of the materialist worldview, the reductionist materialism, which will either reduce everything either to material or to spiritual. Lewis is trying to put the two back together, which he sees rightly represented in the incarnation, where human nature is presented as having something obviously in common with the other animals, insofar as we're material, and yet also having a rational nature, which the other animals don't have, but furthermore a spiritual nature, because of course God himself takes on human flesh. So we're made in the image of God, but God himself becomes in the image of man, and thereby not only condescends to become man, but in the resurrection and the ascension takes up humanity into himself. Now that process of the up and down process, Lewis wants to pull back into the framework of his readers' imaginations. And to do that, we could talk about widening the world, but really he's deepening the world for us. It was flat, as flat can be, and you can stretch it as long as you want, but it's just still a two-dimensional line. And he wants to give us a sense of a new perspective on that. And to do that, he wants to introduce us with supernatural beings and supernatural agency and supernatural design. And that's not the easiest thing for us to do, because we have become accustomed to the flattening effect of the Enlightenment's instruction, because we've been educated through the Enlightenment schools for a very long time, which have categorically dismissed any dimension that can't be reduced to empirical observation. Remember, empirical science is simply using the five senses that we can, as you would have learned in the scientific method in schools. Right? That is the scientific method. You can observe, you can, under the same conditions, if you repeat the experiment and you get the same outcome, then it's demonstrated that what you have is a fact. Now, a fact is something literally that we make, that we've made, not that we've invented it, but in the sense that we've made certain for ourselves. We've proved through experience. And that experience, again, is reducing the framework of human experience to something that is of sensory character, and only of that. And that only is admitted as science or knowledge. Now, so knowledge has been reduced to a sensory experience of empirical nature. Now, that's a understanding of science which has held since the late 17th century. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, except to say that only that is science, or only that is knowledge, is to do what Lewis describes in 1943 in a work that he writes in this very same year as Perelandra. It is to constitute the abolition of man. It gets rid of humanity's moral nature. And with that, then, of course, it reduces or eliminates everything that would once have been seen as the substance of a proper education. Cultivating our moral nature in accordance with God's nature, as every major religion will seek to do, as Lewis then describes in The Abolition of Man. I'll come to that in a few classes. In fact, after we go through Perelandra, I think we jump to The Abolition of Man to show exactly that. So this is not just a series of 3 novels in which he is entertaining us or engaging in a type of fiction that he himself is entirely interested in. He is really trying to think theologically and present a theological framework of understanding the world that is going to be, to some degree, counterintuitive to us. So he's rebaptizing the imagination, which has been flattened out by the Enlightenment. Now, the Romantics, as I said, when I looked at Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, they talk about the imagination as well. In fact, they see it as the primary faculty, and it's the way of fighting against the empirical reductionism of the Enlightenment and its appeal to reason, which is reductionistic, they say, and they're correct. But they connect the imagination to feelings. And Lewis is not so, well, he's a little bit too well educated to accept that an appeal to the passions is going to be sufficient for what we want to do in appealing to the imagination. Because the passions lead us astray. The passions can lead us to speculate on things that are wholly untrue. And if you look at a portrait of the imagination a little bit before the Romantics, as we saw in A Midsummer Night's Dream, if you were in my Shakespeare class, we could see that Shakespeare was presenting 2 possibilities for the imagination. One is that it will wholly lead you astray. You'll imagine things that aren't there. You'll be terrified by them. You'll be led into a sort of a madness. And the other is an imaginative type of experience in which you experience things that the reason has lost sight of. So imagination can reconstitute and give us a clearer vision of what reality is, or it can lead us wholly astray. In the Enlightenment's estimation, it only leads us astray. It gives us, and so it is made up. It's make-believe, and it dismisses all fiction in accordance with that view. And you've heard that view because you heard it in schools. And so what we are doing here in university studying literature is seeing basically as maybe entertaining, but not of significance as an actual study, let alone an engagement in an area of knowledge. That's the total dismissal of it. Lewis is at pains to present us with something not only is going to delight us and entertain us, but also to teach us. And what it's trying to teach us about is something that he will, a writer of his contemporary by the name of Rudolf Otto, I have not mentioned him yet, and it just occurred to me I have to mention him, which is the holy, the knowledge of the holy. He's a 20th century author. And furthermore, what Otto calls the numinous. Wonder if I can find that. I'm sure I can pull that up quickly here and get it here. I'll just put holy, and that should work. No, Holy Roman Emperor, that's not, okay. The idea of the holy, I got it wrong. It's not the knowledge of the holy, it's the idea of the holy. So this is a text from 1923. Lewis read it and admired it, as did T.S. Eliot. And in it, he talks about the idea of the non-rational factor in the divine in its relation to the rational. And Lewis is trying to do something of that in his story to introduce the idea of the numinous as a non-rational form of perception that nonetheless is connected to the rational. That's how he begins the story. I mentioned that because that's actually how Perelandra begins, is that very encounter with a supernatural form of agency, which he called the Aldila, angels. Right? That's how the story begins. And he wants us to, I'm going to spend a little time how he comes into the story, as it were, because it's a sort of a framework. He begins with Lewis and Ransom, and then he will conclude by leaving that, the same sort of framework that we saw in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And then there's the story within the story. But the reader, he immediately wants to address the reader's awareness of things and to help the reader to think on a different plane. And so he begins this, sometimes it's called Voyage to Venus, this book Perelandra, knowing, however, that Ransom can't just introduce Ransom and Ransom's way of looking at things, because Ransom no longer begins from the perspective that his readers do, because he has been changed in the first experience written about in Out of the Silent Planet. He is now a character who has moved on a little bit, but we have not necessarily done so. So he needs to bring us to from a perspective that is more akin to our own, and that is of Lewis himself. So he introduces Lewis and reintroduces himself, rather, as a character, because at the end of Out of the Silent Planet, he already heard the stories of what happens. And Lewis is happy then to give his disquiet, to convey his disquiet about what he is experiencing here. But with that, to confront the reader with the sorts of epistemological and experiential problems that the story of Ransom on Perelandra is going to recount. So it is a retelling of Paradise Lost. Oh, by the way, preface to Paradise Lost, Lewis wrote in 1941. So between the first novel, 1937, Out of the Silent Planet, and this one, 1943, lies Lewis's preface to Paradise Lost, in which he talks a great deal about Milton's theology. And so Milton is in his mind, clearly from what we see in terms of his scholarly corpus of writing. One of his best introductions, by the way, if you want something to help you with Paradise Lost, read Lewis's preface. It is genuinely a preface. It doesn't intrude upon your sensibilities, tell you what the author believes about it, but really tries to help you see the way Milton would have read the work. But he comes again back to this to himself because he represents the reader then. So Lewis presents himself to be more naive than he actually is, because of course Lewis is the one who's creating the character of Ransom, and Ransom at the conclusion of the trilogy represents what Lewis thinks. At the beginning, he represents a character that's more like you and I. And Lewis, having seen Ransom develop as a character, can't start his second story from Ransom's perspective without losing us. So he goes back to, here's Lewis speaking with Ransom, and now Lewis himself is going to be representing us in how he experiences this sense of the numinous and the Eldila right at the outset of the story. So when he meets, and he doesn't want to jump immediately into theology. And note that his description here right at the outset, when he comes to describe this and describe the characters that he is about to meet, Ransom had met other things in Mars besides the Martians. He had met the creatures called Eldila, and especially that great Eldil who was the ruler of Mars, or in their speech, the Oiarsa of Malacandra. And then he comes to describe these characters. Now he could, if he wanted to, because they are angels, just describe it in theological terms. But that would be begging the question, and to some degree requiring his readers to already believe in angels. And he doesn't want to do that right away. He wants to blur the boundary between the empirical, biochemical, physical thing and what we mean by an angel which has capacities that transcend that. So he describes it in chemical terms. And only then will he try and collapse the categories between the two. And he'll push us to reconsider the boundary lines between the natural and the supernatural. So here's how he does it. The Eldila are very different from any planetary creatures. Their physical organism, if organism it can be called, is quite unlike either the human or the Martian. They do not eat, breathe, or suffer natural death, and to that extent resemble thinking minerals more than they resemble anything we would recognize as an animal, because of course on planet Earth all animals die. So to call it an animal is going to mistake what he's talking about here. Here's something that does not eat, breathe, or suffer death, like an angel. But he's describing in purely empiricist terms. Though they appear on planets and may even seem to our senses to be something resident in them, the precise spatial location of an Eldil at any moment presents great problems. Remember I said he was going to write this on space, or the problem of space, whereas Tolkien was going to talk about the problem of time. In 1937, the two resolved, Lewis and Tolkien, to come at the problem of modern reductionism from different angles. They seem to be spatially present, and yet they seem not to be here. They seem to be elsewhere as well. The sense that an angel can obey God who is outside space and time, and simultaneously present themselves to us in the way that the angel Gabriel announces the coming of the Redeemer to Mary. God commands, the angel presents, there's a manifestation. They themselves regard space, or, and here's the term that Lewis invents, or deep heaven. Remember, it's not broadening our perspective, it's deepening it, giving us a different dimension, are their true habitat. And the planets are to them not closed worlds, but merely moving points, perhaps even interruptions in what we know as the solar system, and they as the field of Arbol. That's referring back to the terminology he used in his last novel. At present, I was going to see Ransom as in answer to a wire, which had said, come down on Thursday if possible. It's an old form of technology, the telegraph. If possible, business. I guess what sort of business he meant, and that was why I kept on telling myself that it would be perfectly delightful to spend a night with Ransom, and also kept on feeling that I was not enjoying the prospect as much as I ought to. So here he introduces another thing that I really think is very important in Perelandra. He introduces the idea of conscience and moral awareness, and also of the possibility of disobeying what is reasonable and what is good. And not only the possibility of resisting it, but the temptation to do exactly that. Because remember, both Lewis, the character here, and Ransom are fallen creatures. And they have already been corrupted by original sin. And so when they know what the right thing to do is, they don't want to do it. That resistance to even, not just to obeying and doing the right thing, but to even seeing it is what Lewis wants to depict to the reader. It's very subtly done, and it's necessary, and it's also crucial to the temptation that the Green Lady experiences on Perelandra. It's an internal temptation to disobey. And Lewis wants to, in a sense, get inside the mind of Eve in a way that Milton didn't do in Paradise Lost. And I think that in this sense, Lewis's work is building on Milton's Paradise Lost, but giving us a dimension that we would call the psychological dimension. And so in that sense is actually a tip of the hat to the Romantics. And what I think he's further doing is expanding on what Milton presents as the consolation to Adam and Eve as they're thrown out of paradise, which is that they will have a paradise within, happy or far. If they have faith in the Redeemer, if they walk as in his presence, if they obey his commands, then they will have within them a paradise lost, a paradise within, happy or far, and then they will not be loath to leave this paradise. So they have a sense of innocence before God that comes from obedience to God. And obedience then becomes the hallmark of this story, and how the character of Ransom is going to progress from a being that's been thrown into a supernatural event, story by God. Lewis calls him the emperor over the sea in the Narnia Chronicles. Here he's presented as what? What's the term? What's the term used for God in this? Mal-el-dil. He uses the word el, the Hebrew word el, in that. Mal-el-dil has orchestrated the whole plot from the beginning and has pulled Ransom into the story. And again, I said last time, for H.G. Wells, there is no orchestrator of the plot. Events happen. They happen by accident. There's no meaning or purpose to it other than to tell the story, but it's not supernaturally orchestrated. Whereas in Lewis's story, it is supernaturally orchestrated from the outset. And Ransom is one of the key pieces on the chessboard of Mal-el-dil's orchestration. That's also something. He doesn't only want us to get the sense that there is a supernatural, but that the supernatural has providential aims, and the providential aims are good. And they're going to be contrary to forces and superior to the forces that oppose his good and righteous aims. And Ransom, as a character who has, because of his human nature, been corrupted by sin, will resist or find it very difficult to do what he's been called to do. And that temptation within him mirrors the temptation that the Green Lady will experience. And the reader, reading from the perspective of first Lewis and then Ransom, has to recognize, when I am reading this account, is my reading of it not influenced by my own corrupt human nature? Do I want to disbelieve this, and why do I want to disbelieve it? So it's not just introducing a new category of the supernatural. It's to acknowledge that I don't want to believe that this is true, because if it is true, then the implications for me as a reader are consequential in how I live outside of the reading experience of the story. Does that make sense? That all of those things are what Lewis is trying to do in this story. Now, he didn't do it in the first. In Out of the Silent Planet, it was a character that was confronting a Enlightenment anthropology and wanted to rewrite that account that H.G. Wells does. Here he wants to move it into a spiritual plane in a way that we didn't see in the first. And then in the third, novel, we are going to find that we are involved in an interplanetary war conducted in a university, in which we find that Ransom is being opposed by the Modern Research University, and it in turn is being ruled by satanic forces. Lewis already thinks the third, by the way. He actually thinks in the third that in the modern university, in its understanding of human nature and its understanding of science and its understanding of religion, it's already been influenced by the doctrine of demons, and not just by the doctrine of demons, by the demons themselves. They're actually involved in the realm of the university. And remember, when we think about the university, it is a medieval institution, but come the Reformation, it takes on a different character. And it is predicated on the significance of the Word of God and its significance in all areas of life. Remember, it began the Reformation began in a university when Luther nailed the 95 Theses to Wittenberg door. He is a professor of the university there. He's a monk, yes, but it's actually a university debate. It's a university context. People always want to make it about the church. And it is about the church, but the church and the academy they overlap significantly. And the debate is then about the significance of the meaning of the word faith and the justification by faith. It is an academic debate, but it is a spiritual debate. And it continues to be a spiritual debate in the academy, is what Lewis is implying. And he's not just implying, he's going to make it out to be a literal battle of within the university. But he's not there yet. That's just where it's going, but he can't jump immediately to that hideous strength, which he presents as a Tower of Babel. If you want to buttress the argument I just made, it's about building up knowledge, a tower of knowledge that will go up to heaven. Whereas here we have the God's perspective orchestrating the plot in which the Tower of Babel is actually responding to God's own initiative, trying to stop Mal-el-Dil's power and his intent here. So these are described, as I say, as something akin to thinking minerals, whatever that means. But that's the closest he can approximate in the way we look at things. And as I say, it's less accurate than just calling them angels. And Lewis knows that it's less accurate. But it is more helpful as a bridge to where he wants to go, which is to help us to consider a form of being that is supernatural in its agencies. So, and the boundaries then between theological and scientific are exactly the things that he wants to address right here in the beginning of this story. And so I'll skip over this, but note that he says, as he goes along, and now Lewis is describing his own feelings in going to meet Ransom, because he heard a story and he's been called and he likes Ransom and he'll find this entertainment, but as he goes towards him, he will feel a strange reluctance, if not a desire to run away and not even meet with him. And that will be the same thing that Ransom will experience when he confronts evil and the temptation. He will want to shirk his duties. He'll want to flee. And that then represents the reader. As the reader reads this account, when you hear this story, I'm not only trying to convince you intellectually of a category, I'm trying to push against your every fallen, sinful sensibility to disbelieve that this realm and these entities actually exist. So here's the description of that. What was I? As I plodded along the empty, unfenced road which runs across the middle of Worcester Common, I tried to dispel my growing sense of malaise by analyzing it. What, after all, was I afraid of? The moment I had put this question, I regretted it. I was shocked to find that I had mentally used the word afraid. Up till then, I had tried to pretend that I was feeling only distaste or embarrassment or even boredom. But the mere word afraid had let the cat out of the bag. I realized now that my emotion was neither more, nor less, nor other than fear. And I realized that I was afraid of two things. Afraid that Sooner or later, I myself might meet an eldil, and afraid that I might get drawn in. Now, there's the real one. I suppose everyone knows this fear of getting drawn in. At the moment at which a man realizes that what had seemed mere speculations are on the point of landing him in the Communist Party or the Christian church. Like you feel when you enter a church. If you've never been in a church, you go into a church, you sit at the back. You're worried about, like, I want to observe this, but I want to stay an outsider on this. That's how I, when I came to faith in Durham, I sat at the back for months. I didn't want to engage anyone. I wanted to be observing it. I didn't want anyone to engage me in conversation. I left very quickly after the service. I wanted to look at the lie of the land. The sense that the door is just slammed and left him on the inside. That's what I wanted to avoid. I want to come in, but I want to be able to get out. The thing was such sheer bad luck. Ransom himself had been taken to Mars or Malacandra against his will. Note this. And almost by accident, almost, like how he puts that. And I had become connected with his affair by another accident. Now, in all of his accounts, he's going to dispute the very idea of accidents. But he has no better language to describe it. One thing happens after another, and it seems really bad luck. It's accidental. Lewis or Tolkien will do the same thing in The Lord of the Rings, talk about Aragorn's luck, which after a while, the instances of luck pile up to the extent where it's no longer possible to conclude that it's luck, but rather that something is orchestrating the events. Yet here we were both getting more and more involved in what I could only describe as interplanetary politics. Now, why can he only describe it as that? Because he, as yet, has an unbaptized imagination. He sees it in worldly terms, except that it's now between planets, just like Jupiter, or let's say Mars and Earth, or the moon and Earth. There are two different races, so it's a political realm, except he wants to do exactly something different than Wells and suggests it's not just about the politics of the grand lunar and the politics of Earth, but rather something more than that. So, but again, he speaks here as somebody who has an unbaptized imagination in depicting Lewis, the character. And as the chapter proceeds, Lewis develops this fictional surrogate. So it is Lewis, but again, he's the character. It's not Lewis. This is what Lewis thinks. He develops his sense of unease. And he goes to the point of describing it as a fear of madness. Now, the function of this is not just that to introduce something that is something we can't expect, but rather to show that from the vantage point of the world, what Christians call faith and think reason fits with faith is just craziness. That's what they think. And he himself is dismissing it as a fear of going mad. So he says this, will you believe me when I say that my immediate impulse was to turn back to the station and do something about it? Of course, there was nothing to be done, which could not equally be done by ringing up from the cottage, but at the moment it seemed perfectly obvious that I must retrace my steps, and I had indeed begun to do so before reason or conscience awoke and set me once more plodding forwards. So he wants to run before he can reason or think or consider what's right or wrong. He wants to obey fear. Now, what's interesting there is Lewis is then describing an empirical response as a response of fear, as a non-rational. Even though it's called scientific, he says that it's based in fear. If you wanted to be more, and I think that's an accurate portrait, you'll know in the Gospels that Jesus, when he comes to people, the first thing he tells them is don't be afraid. Fear motivates our actions far more than we think. And the antithesis to that is believe. And don't doubt. And doubt's connected to fear. So what Lewis here presents as reason and conscience are the twin ways in which he depicts grace to work in the human psyche. He does that in Mere Christianity. He talks about the significance of conscience as well as the significance of reason. Those two things will work in a believer's life to orientate them and allow the God's grace to lead them. The voice of conscience. And the voice of conscience then becomes something that Lewis introduces in Perelandra and will be a dominant voice, I think, in the whole exchange. And this is very unusual for a novel, and I think this is what makes it such a good novel. I don't think it's as good as Till We Have Faces, but in a way it's better because of this. Because it really talks about the significance of conscience and determining action here, and makes us attentive to something within us that could do the right thing or do the wrong thing, and also reveals our inclination to run away from even the consideration of the right and the wrong thing. And that's what science allows us to do, is to be comfortable in dismissing this whole situation. We can be comfortable because science has proved that there is no such thing as good and evil. Can't see it. Let me carry on with this. So, and note that he describes this. The truth was that all I heard about them, the elder, served to connect two things which one's mind tends to keep separate, and that connecting gave one a sort of shock. We tend to think about non-human intelligence in two distinct categories, which we label normal and supernatural, respectively. We think, in one mood, of Mr. Wells as Martians, very unlike the real Malacandrians, by the by, or his Selenites. In quite a different mood, we let our minds loose on the possibility of angels, ghosts, fairies, and the like. Remember, he writes on science fiction, talks about this. Lewis or Tolkien will write a work that we're going to read in a couple of weeks on fairy, addressing the same issue. But the very moment we are compelled to recognize a creature in either class as real, the distinction begins to get blurred. And when it is a creature like an Eldil, the distinction vanishes altogether. And this is what he intends here, is to blur the distinction, if not collapse it. These things were not animals. To that extent, one had to classify them with the second group. But they had some kind of material vehicle whose presence could, in principle, be scientifically verified. To that extent, they belonged to the first group. The distinction between natural and supernatural, in fact, broke down. And when it had done so, one realized how great a comfort it had been. How great a comfort it had been. The comfort, note the word here. A comfort, it gave us strength. The word fort in there. It strengthened us. It steeled us against the idea of our categories being invalid. How it had eased the burden of intolerable strangeness which this universe imposes on us by dividing it into two halves and encouraging the mind never to think of both in the same context. What price we may have paid for this comfort in the way of false security and accepted confusion of thought is another matter. So, note that Lewis describes this in terms of, again, breaking down the boundaries, and yet he finds it impossible to, and describes himself falling into something akin to a state of paranoia, if not madness, in just entertaining the possibility here. And again, Lewis does this as a man who was an adult convert in his late 20s, knows how Christians are presented, and says that if I admit the postulates of the Christian faith as real, then my concept of reality is going to alter significantly to the point where I am going to question whether I can even be considered to be sane, rational in my nature, because rationality has been pegged with empirical reality and can't contradict it. And yet this requires me, even though it's rational, to contradict empirical reality as the only accessible way of understanding something that's entirely rational. So if that's the case, then maybe I'm just going mad, because mad people have no touch with a rational reality. Or rather, what they say is entirely reasonable, but there is no evidence for it from the vantage point of anyone other than themselves. They're making it up. It's in their heads. So Lewis describes his paranoia from the outside, by the way. Interesting as well. And even when he writes with a tone akin to horror, he does so from an objective point of view. So he says this: then came a moment, the first one of absolute terror, and I had to bite my lip to keep myself from screaming. That's him describing himself from the outside, not from the inside. We see him talking about biting his lip, but telling us what's inside of that. So objective from the outside. And the reference to his thoughts then as childish, the idea that there are creatures that contradict explanation, is entirely deliberate. So he goes on to say, note all this is about his experience of this. And they said they call it a breakdown at first. Wasn't there some mental disease in which quite ordinary objects looked to the patient unbelievably ominous? Looked, in fact, just as that abandoned factory looks to me now, great bulbous shapes of cement, strange brickwork bogies glowered at me over dark, dry, scrubby grass pockmarked with gray pools, etc. And he is reminded of all these types of things. Anyways, I don't want to spend any more time on this, but what Lewis will then do as he walks into Ransom apartment is he will fumble around in the dark, and he will encounter, as his shins bark against it, this white, I don't even know, it's like a coffin, which is not there. He's been in Ransom's apartment many times, and there's something there. He didn't see it, but he can smell it. And that is introducing something that's very, again, sensory, but not usually something that we associate with something rational. So it's a dimension that is, again, not audible, not visible, but still an aspect of our sensory experience. So he introduces that there. I'll just read the passage. I groped a few paces forward, hit my shin violently against something, and fell. I sat still for a few seconds, nursing my leg. I thought I knew the layout of Ransom's hall sitting room pretty well and couldn't imagine that I'd blundered into. Presently, I groped into my pocket, got out of my matches, and tried to strike a light. The head of the match flew off. I stamped on it and sniffed to make sure it was not smoldering on the carpet. So we go from a description of Lewis's mental condition to a description of the external world without any emotional depiction. So again, he's breaking down the separation of these two things. So it's clear he's not hallucinating because he's just described what he's done. So one seems totally crazy to him, and the other is, I did this. So what Lewis is doing here is acquainting the viewer or the reader with and introducing the reader to a way of thinking about his character and thinking correctly about his character. So I go on. I rose gingerly. I won't even bother finding it on this thing. I rose gingerly and felt my way forward. I came at once to an obstacle, something smooth and very cold that rose a little higher than my knees. I groped my way along this to the left and finally came to the end of it. It seemed to present several surfaces, and I couldn't picture the shape. It seems to have dimensions to it. It was not a table, for it had no top. One's hand groped along the rim of a kind of low wall, the thumb on the outside and the fingers down inside the enclosed space. And note that he's employing the touch now, not just the smell and the sight or the hearing. And mentally, he is trying to use the candle, the light, to allow him to reason about it. And yet he can't deny his sensations, but he can't reason about it because he can't see. And when I heard Ransom's new name pronounced, which he now does, he hears for the first time. So he's employed all five senses. When I heard his name pronounced, and almost, but not quite simultaneously, I saw the thing I feared so long to see. Now he sees. What I saw was simply a very faint rod or pillar of light. Since I saw the thing, I must obviously have seen it white or colored, but no efforts of my memory can conjure up the faintest image of what that color was. I try blue and gold and violet and red, but none of them will fit. It was not at right angles to the floor. It wasn't wholly upright. What one actually felt at the moment was that the column of light was vertical, but the floor was not horizontal. The whole room seemed to have heeled over as if it were on board ship. Its mere presence abolished the terrestrial horizontal. I had no doubt at all that I was seeing an Eldil. But when he sees it, his notion of seeing is distorted by the whole experience. And that's because the Eldil is in the presence of the deep heaven while simultaneously being here. He'll describe the Eldil later in the novel as appearing to be moving at extraordinary speed and talking about senses of light and how we perceive light, etc. So he's, as I say, the whole of this is trying to baptize the readers into an imaginative way of exploring his sense of the numinous, which he needs in order to describe what is going on on Perelandra. So let me go to a little bit of that. But I spent a lot of time at the beginning, but I think that is very important for understanding what Lewis is trying to do here to the reader. It's introducing a new hermeneutic way of interpreting experience. So it's not just, I'm going to include myself in the novel because I concluded with myself in the last novel. It's trying to reframe the reader's way of looking at things. And then he talks about the war that ensues, and I'll read this as well. The idea of a spiritual versus a physical war. 24. I don't know if I won't bother. I'll just read it from my account. It's on page 24 in this version here. But look here, Ransom, my voice trailed off. I know, said he with one of his singularly disarming smiles. You are feeling the absurdity of it. Dr. Elwyn Ransom setting out single-handed to combat powers and principalities. You may even be wondering if I've got megalomania. I didn't mean that quite, said I. Oh, but I think you did, says Ransom. At any rate, that is what I have been feeling myself ever since that thing was sprung on me. But when you come to think of it, is it odder than what all of us have to do every day? When the Bible used that very expression about fighting with principalities and powers and depraved hypersomatic beings at great heights, our translation is very misleading at that point, by the way. It meant that quite ordinary people were to do the fighting. Oh, I dare say, said I, Lewis, but that's rather different. That refers to a moral conflict. Ransom threw back his head and laughed. Oh, Lewis, he said, you are inimitable, quite inimitable. Say what you like, Ransom. There is a difference. Yes, there is, but not a difference that makes it megalomania to think that any of us might have to fight either way. I'll tell you how I look at it. Haven't you noticed how in our own little war here on Earth, remember this is 1943, Second World War, our own little war here on Earth, there are different phases. And while any one phase is going on, people get into the habit of thinking and behaving as if it was going to be permanent. Just like elections and so forth. They act as if the current situation is the permanent one, and then things flip around and they are totally disoriented. But really the thing is changing under your hands all the time, and neither your assets nor your dangers this year are the same as the year before. Now, your idea that ordinary people will never have to meet the dark Eldila in any form, except a psychological or moral form, as temptations or the like, is simply an idea that held good for a certain phase of the cosmic war. The phase of the Great Siege, the phase which gave to our planet the name of Thulkandra, the silent planet. But supposing that phase is passing, in the next phase it may be anyone's job to meet them. Well, in some sense, quite in a quite different mode. I see. I don't imagine I've been selected to go Perelandra because I'm anyone in particular. No one ever can see, or not till long afterwards, why anyone was selected for any job. And when one does, it is usually some reason that leaves no room for vanity. Certainly it is never for what the man himself would have regarded as his chief qualifications. I rather fancy I am being sent because those two blackguards who kidnapped me and took me to Malacandra did something which they never intended. Now talk about orchestration events and providence. They did something for which they never intended, namely gave a human being a chance to learn that language. What language do you mean? Presahlab, of course, the language I learned in Malacandra. But surely you don't imagine they will speak the same language on Venus. Didn't I tell you about that? Well, of course they do. So they all speak this old solar, and they do. So that's the reason. But it wasn't the reason they brought them there, but it was Mal-Eldil's reason to bring Ransom to an acquaintance with the language that is used outside of the Earth. And thereby he became then a vehicle for the next phase. So it's preparatory. The first novel prepared Ransom for what came next. He had no idea when he first started out that that was even the case, but it's step 1, stage 2, stage 3. And all of that with a providential aim. And so there is the relation of this to a spiritual war, which he addresses. Moving on in 42 and 43, when he has finally landed, and so that he goes up in this white box, which he gets from David Lindsay's Voyage to Arcturus. By the way, he just plucks that and throws it in. Lewis is happy to introduce those sorts of things. And he comes to a planet which we're going to call Perelandra. It's Venus. And the description of this place is, I think, rather extraordinary. I'll skip over some of it. But I want to get to the point where he's exposed to pleasure. Remember, Eden means delight in the Hebrew. And he comes to experience a great globe of yellow fruit, page 42, hung from trees, clustered as toy balloons on the back of the balloon man and about the same size. He picked one of them, turned it over and over. The rind was smooth and firm and seemed impossible to tear open. Then, by accident, one of his fingers punctured it and went through into coldness. So inside the fruit is coldness. How would you have expected that? Is it not the same temperature as outside? No, it's cooler. We associate coolness with refreshing as well. And it has that coldness as about it already. And after a moment's hesitation, he put the little aperture to his lips. He had meant to extract the smallest experimental sip, but the first taste put his caution all to flight. It was, of course, a taste, just as his thirst and hunger had been thirst and hunger, but then it was so different from every other taste that it seemed mere pedantry to call it a taste at all. It was like the discovery of a totally new genus of pleasures. It wasn't a pleasure alongside the others. It was a whole different genus of pleasures. Something unheard of among men, out of all reckoning, beyond all covenant. For one draught of this on earth, wars would be fought and nations betrayed. It could not be classified. He could never tell us when we came back to the world of men whether it was sharp or sweet, savory or voluptuous, creamy or piercing. Not like that was all he could ever say to such inquiries. As he let the empty gourd fall from his hand and was about to pluck a second one, it came into his head that he was now neither hungry nor thirsty. And so what's he going to do? And yet to repeat a pleasure so intense and almost so spiritual seemed an obvious thing to do. So what does he do? His reason, or what we commonly take to be reason in our own world, was all in favor of eating this miracle again. The childlike innocence of fruit, the labors he had undergone, the uncertainty of the future, all seemed to commend the action. Yet something seemed opposed to this, quote unquote, now reason. It is difficult to suppose that this opposition came from desire. For what desire would turn from so much deliciousness? But for whatever cause, it appeared to him better not to taste again. Perhaps the experience had been so complete that repetition would be a vulgarity, like asking to hear the same symphony twice in a day. Now, that depiction of an experience that's so right that it doesn't need to be repeated is exactly what happened on Malacandra when the Hrasa described the process of mating and having children. The sexual encounter was something that they wrote their poetry about. They reflected on in hindsight. They spent their lives building up to it. They did it once, and then that was the end of it. And they saw no need to repeat it. To Ransom, this was an impossible thing to imagine even. But likewise, our experiences of pleasure aren't really connected to the meaning and purpose of it, whereas on Malacandra, there was a purposiveness and a celebration and a delight, and you almost want to say a festival and something sacred about what could happen at any one moment in time. And on earth, of course, it does happen, where sex can be used for the purpose of pleasure but not procreation. And in fact, what we do, as Lewis well knows, is we separate the two and thereby derive it of meaning and purpose and thereby desecrate the sexual act. I'm comparing the two, but he is talking about a unique experience that's so pleasurable that one wants to instantly repeat it, and yet he has a sense that he ought not to do it. And the question is he going to obey that sense? His reason would lead him to do it again, but he resists that. And what he resists as reasonable is actually a fallen purpose of reason. Remember, Milton talks about right reason. Reason obeys the will, he says. And he wills not to do it. He decides he's not going to do it. He obeys. And he's not even sure what it is. So his experience in denying himself a pleasure which seems so intense that everything in him would want to repeat it is nonetheless resisted. And this depiction of a moral battle within Ransom, he repeats throughout the whole story. Very important here. And so Ransom, to some degree, is like an unfallen Adam, but on the other hand, this is an Adam that's already fallen. And the real Adam in here has been separated from the Green Lady. He's on another island. He can't stand with her in the temptation. Remember in Milton's Paradise Lost, he separates Adam and Eve experiences the temptation at the hands of the serpent. Lewis decides to follow Milton's example, and he separates the two. But he is sent down, unlike in Milton's Paradise Lost, as somebody who could come alongside Eve and prevent the temptation from falling. But now we have a man who learns the language of old solar, can speak it, and is trying to stop the temptations that will occur through another man, Weston, a scientist who has been inhabited by the devil. So again, and unlike Paradise Lost, we don't have a serpent here. We have a man. We have two men. One is inhabited by the Spirit of God, and the other is inhabited by the Spirit of Satan. At the beginning of chapter 4, Lewis deliberately echoes Milton. At Ransom's waking, something happened to him which perhaps only happens to a man until he's out of his own world. He saw reality and thought it was a dream. That's how Milton's Adam describes the creation of Eve. Those very words. He thinks that he's dreaming, and there she is, right in front of him. Remember, God puts Adam into a deep sleep, takes her out of the rib. He is imagining, because it's so extraordinary, the pleasure, the delight, the sense of correctness. And he thinks he must be dreaming, and there she is, right in front of him, and she's running from him, furthermore, which is interesting. But he awakes from that. But that's how Milton, again, or Lewis echoing Milton's discussion here. And he then sees a being there, which is serpentine with two shining reptilian wings, bluish gold and bat-like. think there's a depiction of that here. Is that right? Yeah, this sort of thing here. And he's uncertain how to proceed. It detached itself from the tree, gave itself a shake, opened two shining reptilian wings, bluish gold and bat-like. When it had shaken these and closed them again, it gave Ransom another long stare, and at last, half waddling and half crawling, made its way to the edge of the island, buried its long metallic-looking snout in the water. When it had drunk, it raised its head and gave a kind of croaking bleat, which was not entirely unmusical. Then it turned, looked yet again at Ransom, and finally approached him. And then here's the thought. It's madness to wait for it, said the false reason. Now it's described as false reason. But Ransom set his teeth and stood. Note that he has to have courage now. And this is something that's building in Ransom, and he's going to need it for the third iteration. The moral development of Elwyn Ransom, and he will become a man with a chest. The very thing that Lewis is depicting in The Abolition of Man as lacking in our modern education is something that Elwyn Ransom will possess in spades because of his experiences and because he listens to the voice of conscience and does the right thing. His courage will grow. But it came right up to him, began nudging him with its cold snout about his knees. He was in a great perplexity. Was it irrational? Was it rational? And was this how it talked? Was it irrational but friendly? And if so, how should he respond? You could hardly stroke a creature with scales. Or was it merely scratching itself against him? At that moment, with a suddenness which convinced him it was only a beast, it seemed to forget all about him, turned away and began tearing up the herbage with great avidity, etc. Feeling that honor was now satisfied, he also turned away back to the woods. But it's not an unimportant encounter. His courage has been awoken in the face of this strangeness. Then he will have another problem, and these are the voices in his head. And as I say, the framework of conscience there. And then for the first time, he sees the Green Lady. This is page 52. There were two of them, but then there was a human form which stepped ashore, turned with a slight inclination of its body toward the fish, and then vanished from sight of the whole island, slid over the shoulder of the billow. With beating heart, Ransom waited till it was in view again. This time it was not between him and the sky. For a second or so, the human figure was undiscoverable. A stab of something like despair pierced him. Then he picked it out again, a tiny, darkish shape moving slowly between him and a patch of blue vegetation. He waved and gesticulated and shouted till his throat was hoarse, but it took no notice of him. Every now and then he lost sight of it. Even when he found it again, he sometimes doubted whether it was not an optical illusion, some chance figuration of foliage, which his intense desire had assimilated to the shape of a man, but always, just before he had despaired, it would become unmistakable again. Then his eyes began to grow tired, and he knew that the longer he looked, the less he would see, but he went on looking nonetheless. And then, so there's the first sight of something human, and the Green Lady. And the Green Lady, when he finally sees her, page 54, sees her waving and shouting, and he's delighted that a being has seen him and is pleased to see him. The running, the waving, the shouts had not been intended for him. And the green man was not a man at all, but a woman. So now I'll read the passage because it's so good. It was difficult to say why this surprised him so. Granted the human form, he was presumably as likely to meet a female as a male, but it did surprise him, so that only when the two islands once more began to fall apart into separate wave valleys did he realize that he had nothing to say to her, but stood staring like a fool. And now that she was out of sight, he found his brain on fire with doubts. Was this what he'd been sent to meet? He had been expecting wonders, had been prepared for wonders, but not prepared for a goddess carved apparently out of green stone, yet alive. And then it flashed across his mind, he had not noticed it while the scene was before him, that she had been strangely accompanied. She had stood up amidst a throng of beasts and birds as a tall sapling stands among bushes. By the way, that depiction will be taken right out of Song of Songs as well. Big pigeon-colored birds and flame-colored birds and dragons and beaver-like creatures about the size of rats and heraldic-looking fish in the sea of her feet. Or how do you imagine that? And she sees him in the next page, and she's talking to the animals, and Ransom decides he's going to speak using the old solar tongue. "I am from another world," he began, and then stopped. The green lady had done something for which he was quite unprepared. She raised her arm and pointed at him, not as in menace, but as though inviting the other creatures to behold him. At the same moment, her face changed again, and for a second, he thought she was going to cry. Instead, she burst into laughter. Peal upon peal of laughter till her whole body shook with it, till she bent almost double, with her hands resting on her knees, still laughing and repeatedly pointing at him. The animals, like our own dogs in similar circumstances, dimly understood that there was merriment afoot. All manner of gambolling, wing clapping, snorting, and standing upon hind legs began to be displayed. And still the green lady laughed, till yet again the wave divided them and she was out of sight. Now remember, Ransom here is naked. He's a middle-aged man, portly, sunburnt, and he has a green lady who he describes as a goddess looking at him and pointing at him and laughing. That's not going to go over well. What's his response? Ransom was thunderstruck. Had the Eldila sent him to meet an idiot? Or an evil spirit that mocked men? Or was it, after all, a hallucination? For this was just how a hallucination might be expected to behave. Then an idea occurred to him for which would have been taken much longer, perhaps, to occur to me or you. It might not be she who was mad, but he who was ridiculous. He glanced down at himself. Certainly his legs presented an odd spectacle, for one was brownish red, like the flanks of a Titian satyr, and the other was white, by comparison, almost a leprous white, etc. And so he smiled at him in spite of himself at the very undistinguished career he was having on Perelandra. And now he goes down, and this is towards the bottom of 56. On the ancient planet Malacandra, he had met creatures who were not even remotely human in form, but who had turned out on further acquaintance to be rational and friendly. Under an alien exterior, he had discovered a heart like his own. Was he now to have the reverse experience? For now he realized that the word human, in scare quotes, refers to something more than the bodily form or even to the rational mind. It refers also to that community of blood and experience which unites all men and women on the earth. Isn't that interesting? It's not just the body, it's not just the reason, it's a community of experience. And hence history is one of the main genres of biblical revelation. A community of experience. But this creature was not of his own race. No windings, however intricate, of any genealogical tree could ever establish a connection between himself and her. In that sense, not one drop in her veins was human. The universe had produced her species and his quite independently. All this passed through his mind very quickly and was speedily interrupted by his consciousness that the light was changing. And then he comes forward and speaks to her before the sun can set, as he perceives it. I am a stranger, I come in peace. Is it your will that I swim over to your land? The green lady looked quickly at him with an expression of curiosity. What is peace? She asked. Ransom could have danced with impatience. Already it was visibly darker, and there was no doubt now that the distance between the islands was increasing. Just as he was about to speak again, a wave rose between them, and once more she was out of sight. And as that wave hung above him, shining purple in the light of the sunset, he noticed how dark the sky had become. And then he has to make a decision, and he jumps in the water towards her in the dark and falls asleep. He's on an island, but the island, unfortunately, is not her island, but still the islands are close together. Chapter 5, the lady's island was floating beside his, divided by only 5 feet or so of water. Providentially. And then the dialogue that ensues is really interesting. I want to spend just a second on it. First thing that the lady says, beginning of chapter 5. Let's see if I can find it here. Chapter 5. Give me that chapter. I was young yesterday, she began, but he did not hear the rest of her speech. The meeting now that it had actually come about, proved overwhelming. You must not misunderstand the story at this point. What overwhelmed him was not in the least the fact that she, like himself, was totally naked. Embarrassment and desire were both 1,000 miles away from his experience. And if he was a little ashamed of his own body, that was a shame which had nothing to do with difference of sex, and turned only on the fact that he knew his body to be a little ugly and a little ridiculous. Still less was her color a source of horror to him. In her own world, the green was beautiful and fitting. It was his pasty white and angry sunburn which were the monstrosity. It was neither of these, but he found himself unnerved. He had to ask her presently to repeat what she was saying. I was young yesterday, she said, when I laughed at you. Now I know that the people in your world do not like to be laughed at. He doesn't even get into that. How is she aware that he didn't like it? She saw his response, but then she was able to reason about it and think about it. Remember, we're going to find out also she communes with Maleldo. She has aspect to can appeal and speak to him for understanding of the situation. You say you were young. He decides to focus on that rather than move away from his anger at being laughed at. Yes. Are you not young today also? Because it's only, again, the next day. How can you describe that as anything other than a day older and still young then? She appeared to be thinking for a few moments so intently that the flowers dropped unregarded from her hand. Now, this moment where she drops flowers from her hand, note Milton's Paradise Lost, when the flowers drop from Adam's hand at the sign of a fall. There's no fall here. Experience has happened. There's no sin that's happened, but a fall of sorts. When Adam sees Eve, the flowers which he gathered to give to Eve when they returned together one another, present in his hand, he lets them drop out of his hand. Milton is describing a fall without a fall. But experience has happened here. But I think he's directly appealing to Paradise Lost in this. I see it now, she said presently. It's a very strange to say that one is young at the moment one is speaking. But tomorrow I shall be older, and then I shall say I was young today. You are quite right. This is great wisdom you are bringing, O piebald man. What do you mean? This looking backward and forward along the line and seeing how a day has one appearance as it comes to you and another when you are in it and a third when it has gone past, like the waves. What's he introduced to her? Time. She had no sense of time. She doesn't see herself as a historical being. She's not been acquainted with the Western world's temporalizing of all experience. The historical critical method in biblical studies. It has not occurred to her to think that way. But now she does and can see of the value of it. But you are very little older than yesterday. How do you know that? I mean, said Ransom, a night is not a very long time. She thought again and then spoke suddenly, her face lightening. I see it now, she said. You think times have lengths. A night is always a night, whatever you do in it. As from this tree to that is always so many paces, whether you take them quickly or slowly. I suppose that is true in a way, but the waves do not always come at equal distances. I see that you come from a wise world, if this is wise. I have never done it before, stepping out of life into the alongside and looking at oneself living as if one were not alive. Do they all do that in your world, Piebald? Now, so what's she doing? Like at the beginning, Lewis wanted to dissociate our sense of the natural and the supernatural, the experiential. Now he's wanting us to think about the way we look at time being an abstraction, looking at ourselves as if we were dead, is an abstraction. We don't see it as an abstraction. We've got clocks on the wall. We govern ourselves in accordance with time. We think it makes sense to do so. Helps us to understand our experiences. But is it actually a human way of looking at it? In looking at Genesis, people are going to be very intently and intensely interested in when creation happened. What day and year BC did God create the heavens and the earth? You know about that. It still is a feature of biblical studies, that discussion point. But the very idea of abstracting human experience and seeing it in terms of time is just it is an abstraction. And is it the correct way of looking at it? That's what he's introducing here in this dialogue, and he's trying to again to make us think differently about space and about time. As I say, Tolkien doesn't take up the notion of time, even though he was supposed to. So Lewis introduces it. Say, I know, Tolkien's not going to do what he said he's going to do, so I'm going to introduce the notion of time. How do you know about other worlds? I know this. Beyond the roof, it is all deep heaven, the high place, and the low is not really spread out as it seems to be, but is rolled up into little balls, little lumps of the low swimming in the high. And the oldest and greatest of them have on them that which we have never seen, nor heard, and cannot at all understand. But on the younger, Mal-Eldil has made it to grow things like us, that breathe and breed. How have you found all this out? Your roof is so dense that your people cannot see through into deep heaven and look at the other worlds. Remember, on Venus, there's what we would call a cloud cover. You can't actually even look up. Up till now, her face had been grave. At this point, she clapped her hands in a smile such as Ransom had never seen changed, or one does not see that smile here except in children, and there was nothing of the child about it here. Oh, I see it, she said. I am older now. Now she's going to keep on talking about older and younger in terms of more experienced. I am older now. Your world has no roof. You look right out into the high place and see the great dance with your own eyes. You live always in that terror and that delight, and what we must only believe you can behold. Is not this a wonderful invention of Mal-Eldil's? When I was young, I could imagine no beauty but this of our own world. But he can think of all and all different. And let me stop of that. He can conceptualize and see space and time outside space and time and see them all different. We can only see one thing in a uniform way. We cannot see in totally different ways and accept that they're all real. So again, he's introducing conceptualizing of things that will help us to understand how God can see in the way that Lewis describes it providentially, because he sees past, present, and future all at once. So I'll leave it off that one. I'll come back next time. I think we did enough of the introduction here. I'm going to want to look at the encounter between the Green Lady and the temptation that seems. I haven't even had Weston land yet, so we'll have to deal with that. Weston will land, and we'll see the transformation of Weston from a man who is a strict empiricist like H.G. Wells's scientist to a man who is now devoted to spirituality. So he's gone from a materialist to being a spiritualist, and is that a better turn? And the answer is no. But it's a different type of encounter and a different sort of threat. And then we'll look at the encounter between Ransom and Weston. And then we're going to want to move on towards the end to the scene at the conclusion of it and the great dance that was just spoken of here before we move on. But I'm done for today.